Hello, this is Paul Rand, host of Big Brains. I wanted to let you know that we recorded this episode before the protests and violence that have swept our country in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. We plan to dig into issues of systemic racism and its implications on future episodes. Today's Big Brains is still very important, perhaps even more so given recent events. What happens to the world after a pandemic?
A lot of people are wondering, does a pandemic cause an economic boom?
That's Ada Palmer. She's an associate professor of early modern European history at the University of Chicago. And the pandemic that she's talking about is not COVID-19 or the 1918 Spanish flu. It's the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague.
I mean, we're talking about these because they're the most famous pandemics that we know of, or large plague events that we know of. And everyone is trying to understand both how it works and how it's going to affect our society.
The Black Death hit the globe in the mid-1300s, and afterwards, Europe entered the period known as the Golden Age, the Renaissance. In many ways, it was a political, artistic, and economic rebirth for the continent. But it wasn't that simple.
When you see the plague is in town, you just leave.
Entire cities, towns, and sectors of the European economy were destroyed. And while some people today point to the Golden Age after the Black Plague as a cause for optimism after COVID-19, we wanted to speak with Palmer to find out how history is often misinterpreted and what we can really learn from the world's most deadly pandemic.
You know, this is going to be a major beginning of changes that are going to go on for several decades.
From the University of Chicago, this is Big Brains, a podcast about pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. On this episode, Ada Palmer and the lessons from the Black Death. I'm your host, Paul Rand. We've been hearing a lot about the 1918 flu pandemic lately, but what you might not know as much about is the Middle Ages Black Death pandemic. And, as it turns out, a lot of our assumptions about the Black Death aren't necessarily true.
People often talk about the Black Death and are used to thinking of it as if it swept in 1348. It kills a third of the population of Europe, half the population of some major cities, and then it's gone, as if it's a one-time event. And it's true that it's a one-time event that it does that giant sweep. But the Black Death remains endemic in Europe, coming back constantly, the way we're used to chickenpox being endemic. It's just a normal thing people get. Or the way we're used to there being a flu season every year, where it comes back regularly. And it remains endemic like that until the 18th century. So from the mid-1300s to the early 1700s. We have this long stretch.
That's a good run.
It's a long run. And it means that in different cities, it won't be everywhere. It's never everywhere all at once again. A particular town or a particular city will have a surge of it. And so when you read letters from the 1500s or the 1600s, and someone is writing to their family saying, you know, I'm coming home from my trip, the family will often reply and say, on your way home, make sure not to go to Padua, make sure to go around it and instead go to this other place because we hear that that town has the plague. It's just a normal thing. People are used to being part of their lives in a chilling way, that cities will get emptied every few years by this.
Of course, we don't expect the coronavirus to last for 300 plus years, but we also don't know what our world will look like after it. Just as with COVID-19, one of the Black Death's pandemic's major impact was on the global economy. But understanding what happened to the economy then is just as complicated as it is today.
It's more dynamic than a lot of people think. We have a myth of a static Middle Ages, but in fact a lot had been shifting and changing. Starting in the 1100s, there had been new developments in banking and the beginning of what we might call insurance.
It started with ships, is that right?
Right. You could take insurance when you are a merchant and you're speculating by investing in a boat to go out and come back with high profit spices. If you think about the situation in the play The Merchant of Venice, where the merchant has sent his ships out and he keeps hearing that they've sunk, and if they all sink, then he's going to be doomed. But if at least one of them comes back with its cargo, then he'll be safe. Well, this is a risk nobody in the period wants to take, so Venice and other cities start offering insurance on your ship, insurance on various other investments, also abilities to invest in city funds As you get more investment, you consequently get more economic interconnection.
It's this interconnectedness that's so important to understanding how the Black Death was able to change economics on a global scale. For example,
England produces lots of wool. And in England, you can easily spin wool into thick, itchy wool thread and make itchy wool cloth. If you want to make fine, high quality, not itchy wool thread, you need a lot of oil as part of the processing of the thread. So they start developing a process where instead of spinning their English wool in England into itchy English cloth, you export your English wool to the Mediterranean. Italians who have lots of cheap olive oil spin it into high quality thread and then re-export that fabric back as a more desirable, higher quality product. This means that goods are moving around more, which also means that people are moving around more, which means that the diseases are able to circulate more quickly. And the speed with which the Black Death moves is partly related to this economic growth, but it also makes the other diseases that had been endemic in Europe for a long time become increasingly deadly as you move from 1200 forward through 1400, so that things like the regular old pox or malaria or dysentery that had always been killing people start killing people more.
so that has a bit of creates a bit of a ripple effect. This affected, for example, one group, the Vikings in Greenland.
I think the Vikings in Greenland are one of the most useful examples to think about what the Black Death actually does, because there's this small colony or settlement rather, of Vikings in Greenland. They'd been there for several centuries already at this point, but they vanish, not in 1348, but in 1410. And we've spent a while trying to figure out why this colony vanishes around then and why it was dwindling at that point. And we used to think that somehow they just couldn't survive there, or that there were environmental shifts and it got colder. But the more we look at it, the more we realize it wasn't that. Our leading theory now is it was economic shifts on the mainland. So they never got the Black Death. There's not enough traffic between Greenland and elsewhere for the disease to make it over. But Greenland's main economic lifeline to Europe was the export of walrus ivory. And when the Black Death hits, the bottom drops out of the luxury goods market for a while because the economy is reeling and changing. And so ships from Norway and so on and Iceland stop coming because nobody wants to go to Greenland, take those risks in order to get walrus ivory when there's no market back at home. So the ships stop coming, and importing of goods to Greenland that people wanted in Greenland stops. It stops being a viable economic space. At the same time that there's a major labor shortage and a lot of unclaimed farmland back on the mainland where we've lost people from the Black Death and therefore we need more people. So we think that as many as could simply resettled back to mainland Europe from Greenland at that point because the bottom fell out of their economic role, which is a good way to think about it, because what a pandemic does is change and accelerate the rate of change of economic things and make certain industries grow and other industries shrink. And right now, if you look at the stock market, if your money was in a company that produces masks or ventilators, you're doing fine. If your money was in an airline, your money is not. Different industries are going up and down. And in the aftermath of the Black Death, we simply see a lot of that where labor is needed shifts, where profits are to be made changes. And lots of people need to adapt to stop doing what their family has done for the last couple generations and do a new job, or stop doing what that individual person has done for the first half of their life and adapt to a new one. Some people can, some people can't. It creates a lot of economic opportunities, but also a lot of hardships.
And the effects of the Black Plague went beyond global economics. It had an immediate impact on labor at a local level.
During the plague itself, and we have descriptions of this from Boccaccio and Petrarch and others, one of the moments of shock is that at the beginning, everyone says, okay, it's another plague. Plagues are normal. Sometimes there's a big bout of pox and it goes away. But as the numbers who die go higher and higher, particularly in cities when it gets near 50% and over 50%, people stop working for their patrons. The servants who've served a family for generations just leave. The whole system breaks down. so that the multi-generational trust relationships between families, governments, the way towns are run, everything shuts down. And sometimes people will have the scary experience of coming in on a ship on the way, from Constantinople back to Venice, and pulling into the harbor, and there's no one there. And what's happened is that there's about a plague at the moment. The entire city is empty. Everyone has just left, which of course brings the plague everywhere, but also results in the complete shutdown and dissolution of this city and its social safety net that had been there even through other times of trial. So there's a lot of severing of old ties and a lot of distrust and a lot of now unprotected wandering labor, which on the one hand has the opportunity to have high wages, but on the other hand has no social safety net to protect it and is easily therefore exploited or worked until old and then abandoned to die. So it results in shifts that are a long way from but a tiny beginning of things like workhouses, which are designed to exploit labor until the person is too old to work and then just let them die, instead of use labor and support the retirement of the person, because that's one of the normal gifts that the patron is expected to give to somebody in return for multi-generational service.
So, can we draw parallels between the Black Plague and the coronavirus? That's after the break. As the world resets, be part of the rethinking, remapping, and retooling to address society's most challenging issues. Be part of lasting change with a part-time UChicago policy degree from the Harris School of Public Policy's Evening Master's Program. Build your data science and analytical toolkit to take the next step in your career. Learn more at harris.uchicago.edu/evening program. When it comes to comparisons between COVID-19 and the Black Death, much of what experts are looking at is whether that pandemic can offer any points of optimism, and Palmer says the biggest one is modern science.
Exactly, because we understand so much now about how diseases work. When the Black Death begins, their medicine is so unfathomably wrong. You just can't believe how wrong it is. When the plague hits Florence, the Florentine government's first action, they take immediate action, immediate state action, feel better everyone, we've taken care of it. They double the penalty for selling meat of male and female animals out of the same meat booth. Because of course what's making people sick is when male animal blood and female animal blood get on each other and cause generative stuff to happen in the meat, and that's going to be what's making you sick. They don't know the first thing about contagion. So when I look at the Black Death and then COVID, or when I look even at the 1918 influenza and COVID, to me the enormous cheering difference is that we know things. While we're not doing everything as perfectly as in an ideal world we could, we can do something. 1918 was an election year, but they didn't talk about delaying the election or vote by mail or any of these other things, because they don't know how influenza spreads enough to do anything helpful. They can't say, okay, well, if we delay the election 1 month, we can have enough wet wipes to sterilize the voting booths after every use, and we can stagger the voting over several weeks and therefore have people contact each other less. They just don't know anything about how to stop influenza from spreading. They just do the election because there's no way they could have made the election safe at all. And we know we can develop a vaccine. We're confident there will be a vaccine. It may be a year or 5 years, right? We don't know how long it'll be until there's an effective vaccine. We all hope it'll be soon. But nobody right now is worried that our grandkids are going to be frequently going through 6 months of being shut in the house because of a COVID epidemic, right? We are confident that that problem will be solved on the decade time scale, that we're going to be dealing with the economic aftermath of losing so many people who would otherwise have been contributors to the economy, of seeing these shifts where certain industries grow and other industries collapse. We're worrying about those long-term questions, and we're worrying about what the loss of the individual people who are being lost is going to do. But we aren't worried about actual COVID epidemics like the one we're having now, shutting down our world over and over and over for the next bunch of generations.
Another point of optimism some are pointing to is the period that immediately followed the height of the Black Death, Europe's Golden Age, also known as the Renaissance. And this is really Palmer's core expertise. In fact, she's working on a book that totally deconstructs our understanding of the Golden Age. So, is that period a reason for optimism? Was the Golden Age really as golden as we all think? And did the plague improve the global economy?
We have some older studies on the Black Death's economic impact on the multi-decade level that suggest that it did. And therefore, for quite a while, it was a belief that it did. There were some studies that showed that after the plague, there's a severe labor shortage. So as a result, wages skyrocket, empowering the working class, empowering people to demand more for their labor, save up, buy land, etc. We've more recently re-examined those studies and done similar studies in other regions, because those studies were done only in specific areas, mainly in the British Isles. And as we've studied more different areas and even different areas there, we've discovered that the economic consequences were much more variable. There were indeed some places where it seems to have empowered labor. There were other places where it weakened populations enough that entrenched elites used this to entrench more and pass laws further restricting the freedom of labor. The first workhouses, which confine laborers to a sort of semi-prison-like environment in order to force them to do a particular work and make them unable to move to other areas where they might get wages increased, are also results of this. So we get a vast range of economic policies implemented by different areas after the Black Death with a range of economic consequences. So when we say Golden Age, and the book is intentionally called Why We Keep Telling the Myth of the Renaissance, when we say Golden Age, there's two different things we often mean, and we assume they go together. One is, it's a golden age in that what it produces is amazing. And it's full of art and culture and music and sparkling cathedrals and new inventions and Leonardo's machines and Michelangelo's amazing sculptures. And that's a golden age that we visit in museums later on and look at in awe. But the other half of what we tend to mean when we say golden age is a good time to live. Is the Renaissance a golden age? In the first definition, yes. In the second definition, absolutely not. No way, no how. The life expectancy drops from, we'd had an average around 35 for average life expectancy in the Middle Ages. In many of these areas, and it drops to the Italian Renaissance urban life expectancy is 18.
That's a drop.
So that's a big drop. And most of those deaths are between the ages of 3 and 12, though a number of them are later mostly men. Mostly men because that's the violence and the wars being deadlier. You know, it's not infant mortality. Infant mortality is constant between medieval and Renaissance. It's all of these extra diseases that come so much more often so that so many people don't make it to 12. And throughout the Renaissance, you have this amazing outpouring of culture, but also these chilling descriptions of what it's like on the ground. You know, Petrarch, who lived through the Black Death and is around in the later 1300s as well, talks about Italy being wounded, that it's wounding itself with constant civil wars. This is what Shakespeare's Montagues and Capulets are based on. And that he fears that if Italy doesn't get it together and stop having civil wars and strife and people trying to take over cities and feuding, that there's going to be an effective apocalypse and Italy will either collapse or be conquered from the outside. If you jump forward through the Renaissance, and there are moments where it's fairly peaceful, but you keep getting these apocalyptic descriptions. There's an amazing letter of 1506 of a friend of Machiavelli writing to Machiavelli, and Machiavelli had just written a verse history of that decade, of the last 10 years. And the friend wrote to Machiavelli and said, Machiavelli, please, you must continue your history and write more about this period, because without a good history of these days, future generations will never believe how bad it was. And they will never forgive us for losing so much so quickly. The decade he's talking about is the decade in which Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa and in which Michelangelo sculpted the David. Is it a golden age? From the museum side, absolutely.
Got it.
But what it felt like living on the ground is a kind of
different
apocalypse.
Story. Are we going to learn something? If you look what they learned during that period and you try to look at parallels now, are we going to learn something out of this period and come out of it in a better state?
I mean, I hope the answer is yes. But if we look at the Black Death, what we see is the policies that go into place afterward vary enormously from place to place, right? Some places create terrible exploitative workhouses. Some places take this opportunity to pass laws that further bind peasants to the land and prevent liberty and migration. Other places don't and allow a liberation of labor, and a lot more people are moving from place to place. And suddenly in Renaissance Florence, day laborers are only working 3 days a week because they earn enough wages in 3 days a week to live on that, and then the rest of the day they spend the other 4 days sitting around looking at art, which is literally true. It's so implausible, and yet it's literally true that they're working fewer hours than we are at this tech level. It's enormous variability based on what policies are used and go into place in different areas. And so I think, will COVID usher in change? Absolutely. Will the change be good? In some places, yes.
And much as labor changed after the Black Death, Palmer says the types of changes we'll experience after coronavirus will depend on the decisions of people in power.
Depending on whether this moment is a moment in which elites who feel afraid decide it's the moment to entrench power or strengthen their stranglehold on monopolizing, whether it's a country that's had monopolization of elections and suppression of opposition parties, or whether it's a country that's had monopolization of employment and suppression of particular ethnic groups, whatever it is, whether that happens, that'll happen in some places. And I think in other places, it'll result in people looking around and saying, oh, wow, actually, in places that have more social safety nets so that when a person gets knocked down, they get up again, instead of getting knocked down and staying down, and therefore ceasing to be a contributor to the economy. The places that have it may be easier to get up again are recovering more quickly and producing economic profits, even for the wealthy, faster. We would therefore benefit by also extending this empowerment.
So let me ask you, if we brought together a room full of world leaders and we put you in front of them and said, and the question was, tell us the takeaways out of studying the Black Plague in particular, and things that you should be keeping in mind, thinking about, planning for coming out of the current COVID-19 situation. What 3-4 pieces of insight would you say, I really want you to think about this because history tells us this is going to be an issue? Where would you guide those folks?
One, remember that morale is one of the victims of this, and that one of the things pandemics do through their extended exhaustion is break down the emotional and cultural apparatus that people have had to deal with grief and to deal with crisis. When you look at Petrarch's letters written during the Black Death, when the first of his friends dies, he says, I'm so sad, but this is God's plan. I know this is part of providence. I know my friend is in a better place now. He's consoling himself using the apparatus of his society. When the second friend has died, he's very, very sad. When the fourth friend has died, when the eighth friend has died, it breaks down. And he can't say it's God's plan anymore. Those letters can't cope. You see him lose it. And all he can say is, I don't understand what our generation has done that's so much worse than every other generation that's ever lived, that we should be punished with this and not anything else. There's no trust anymore. There's only anger. You know, Christianity is, for Petrarch, the social apparatus for understanding and dealing with grief. Our modern society has other apparatuses for dealing with grief. We have funeral ceremonies, we have therapists, we have different philosophies of ethics and ways to live and a wide variety of religions, those are all going to break down for the family who loses 5 people at once.
Okay, so the concept of pay attention to morale is kind of...
Well, and remembering that the breakdown of morale is a form of exhaustion that diminishes cognitive capacity. We have all these studies that show it. Exhaustion, grief, and especially fear diminish cognitive capacity. No one on Earth is operating at 100% right now. No one.
No one is untouched by what we're living through, either as individuals or as societies. And Palmer says it's really important to learn from how different societies are dealing with this.
We can look at different places and say, this country had this bit of safety net work. Let's copy it over here. Because one of the lessons of the disasters of the 20th century has been that nationalism, which was still very powerful after the 19th century in the middle of the 20th, and which is having a resurgence now, often led countries to say, I'm going to not study the policies of these other countries because my policies are best. Right? Canada didn't have a Great Depression because Canada's business and banking policies had a bunch of protections in place, so their stock market never crashed, and they were fine. And the U.S. did not imitate those policies and put in place the things that prevented the Great Depression in Canada into the U.S. afterward, because nationalism meant that people were proud of their own institutions, even if their own institutions didn't work. I think this is a great opportunity for us to observe how our social safety nets are actually functioning. Because there are multiple safety nets in any given society. In our society right now, there's government safety nets, there's family taking care of itself internally, there are local charities, there are religious charities, there are national and global level charities, there are businesses that invest in other local businesses because they're large enough. There are situations like here around Chicago where the university itself is investing in local businesses and feeding local people. And at the end of this, we're going to have an amazing wealth of gatherable data showing us when things really got bad, which social safety nets functioned best, and what did they do, which will give us a better way to study the symbiosis of the multiple overlapping social safety nets that exist, and show us, for example, interesting, in these regions, family did a lot. In these regions, family didn't do a lot. Or among these communities, family did a lot. Among these communities, religious charities did a lot. Among these communities, non-religious charities or local charities or distant ones did a lot. If we can learn about the interconnectedness of our overlapping social safety nets, this thumb on the pressure point of everything is going to very vividly expose how they interconnect and therefore how we can strengthen all of them and make them slightly less redundant. If there are places where we discover that service A broke down completely, but there were still 4 different ways to get service B.
Perhaps the biggest lesson of the Black Death is that the world is going to be changed socially, politically, economically, on a global scale.
It's absolutely going to be a multi-decade economic and business and sort of lived ripple that goes forward. But we're not looking at the centuries that are the aftermath of the Black Death.
Big Brains is a production of the UChicago Podcast Network. If you like what you heard, please give us a review and a rating. The show is hosted by Paul M. Rand and produced by me, Matt Hodap, with assistance from Alyssa Eads. Thanks for listening.